The air in the African Union Summit Hall was thick with anticipation. Heads of state, defense ministers, and financial envoys gathered around the circular table, but all eyes were on two men, one seated in deliberate calm, the other pacing like a wolf on the hunt. Scott Bessent, America's sharp-tongued economic advisor, had just flown in under the pretense of diplomacy. But his tone betrayed his mission. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bessent began, voice cool but edged like a scalpel, "let's stop pretending. Africa has gold, wealth buried beneath the soil you've failed to turn into prosperity. America can help. We have the tools, the capital, the systems. You have opportunity. Let us run your mines. We'll share the profits." A quiet ripple moved through the room. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably, others glanced at Traoré, as if bracing for thunder. Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless. But his stillness was deceptive, it was the silence of a storm gathering strength. Bessent continued, "You're sitting on trillions in resources, and yet your people live on pennies. With American leadership, we can civilize this sector. We can extract value for all." That word, civilize, was the match to dry timber. Traoré finally stood. His chair creaked as it slid back, a small but sharp sound that drew every gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You speak of partnership," Traoré said, "but your mouth smells of conquest." Bessent blinked. Traoré stepped forward slowly, his military boots echoing on marble. "You want our gold, but not our people. You want our land, but not our sovereignty. You want a colony wrapped in contracts and lies." The hall fell silent. Traoré pointed toward the map projected behind Bessent, highlighting regions marked for joint extraction. They were all former colonial sites. "You've come for our mines," Traoré said, each word precise. "Then be ready to leave with nothing but dust in your pockets and shame in your soul." He paused, eyes locked with Bessent's. "Over my dead body." Scott Bessent didn't flinch, at least not visibly. He had negotiated with billionaires, outwitted trade ministers, and outmaneuvered central bank governors. But something about Traoré's tone struck differently. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was final. "Let me be clear," Bessent replied, his smile returning like a mask. "This isn't about conquest. It's about progress. America doesn't want to own Africa, we want to invest in it." "You don't invest in what you respect," Traoré interrupted. "You buy what you plan to break." The murmurs in the room began again. African leaders leaned forward, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. This wasn't just a war of ideology, it was becoming a referendum on the past and future of African sovereignty. Bessent, still poised, clicked a remote and shifted the screen behind him. It displayed glossy projections, GDP boosts, job creation, infrastructure growth. If only African nations allowed American corporations full access to their mines. "You're afraid of losing control," he said, "but you've never had it. The real world runs on capital, not courage." Traoré laughed, quiet, sharp, and stinging. "You confuse cowardice for calculation. You mistake occupation for organization. And you think we don't see the leash behind your offer." He walked to the screen and unplugged the projector cord with a single pull. The graphs vanished. "Here's our new projection, Africa rises, not as your supplier, but as your equal. And it won't happen with your hands in our soil. It'll happen with your hands off it." A low rumble of agreement moved through the room. Some leaders began to nod. Others began to smile. Bessent tried to recover. "That's an emotional stance, not an economic one." Traoré stepped in close. "Tell that to the mother who buries her child near a poisoned river from your last investment. Or the miner who dies under a collapsed shaft while your executives dine in glass towers. Tell them about your projections." Bessent's words stalled in his throat. "This is not 1885, Traoré said, referencing the Berlin Conference. "Africa isn't being carved again. Not by treaties, not by banks, and certainly not by you." The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. Bessent turned to the other delegates, searching for backup among the diplomats, investors, and policy hawks seated in the marble-paneled chamber. But most of them avoided his eyes. A few scribbled notes. One delegate from Ghana simply folded his arms and nodded at Traoré. Traoré let the silence linger. He knew its power. He'd learned it not in lecture halls, but in war zones, in villages turned into graves, in rooms where colonial languages promised peace and delivered chains. Silence was where the truth landed hardest. "You all want our gold," Traoré said, now turning to address the entire hall. "But when we ask for clean water, you send us military advisors. When we demand schools, you send consultants. When we build power for ourselves, you call us unstable." A woman from the French delegation cleared her throat. "With respect, Captain Traoré," she began, "surely collaboration." "This isn't collaboration," he snapped. "This is conquest wrapped in contracts. You come with briefcases instead of rifles, but the intent is the same." Bessent tried once more to regain control. "If you deny access to your resources, you'll isolate your economies. The global markets will adjust," Traoré interrupted. "You forget, Africa isn't just rich in minerals. We're rich in unity now. That's your real fear." He stepped forward again, commanding the floor without needing a podium. "For centuries, we dug the graves of your empires. We laid the rails for your wealth. Now, you come smiling, suits pressed, tongues coated in diplomacy, but your boots are still heavy, your hands still greedy." There was a pause, then slow clapping from the back of the room. A delegate from South Africa. Then one from Senegal. One by one, others joined. Bessent stood frozen as the chamber echoed not with deals, but with defiance. Traoré lowered his voice for the final blow. "You said America will claim Africa's mines? Over my dead body. And if you try, you'll find Africa doesn't bury its warriors anymore. We raise them." The applause swelled. And for the first time that day, Bessent looked uncertain, not as a strategist, not as an economist, but as a man who'd underestimated the storm now rising from the continent he once called a frontier. Outside the hall, the headlines were already erupting. Traoré declares war on neocolonialism. Africa's gold will not be taken. Bessent silenced by Burkina Faso's captain. But inside, the storm had only begun to gather. As Traoré stepped down from the platform, his security detail closed in. Yet it wasn't protection he needed, it was space. Space to move, to shift the balance of power just by standing still. Reporters shouted questions. "Captain, will you reject all Western investment? Is this a declaration of hostility against the U.S.? He paused, glancing briefly toward a journalist with a Burkinabe flag pin on his collar. "Our doors are open to friends," Traoré said calmly, "but not to thieves." Meanwhile, Bessent huddled with a small cluster of American diplomats and oil-backed lobbyists. His jaw was tight, his voice low and sharp. "He's turning this into a battlefield of ideas," one aide whispered. "No," Bessent corrected, "he's turning it into a battlefield. Period." Across the room, a delegate from the UAE leaned toward the Saudi representative. "This man, Traoré, he doesn't bluff." "No," the Saudi replied, nodding slowly. "He bleeds purpose. And purpose is contagious." The mood in the chamber shifted. Delegates once aligned in quiet obedience were now whispering in different languages, Swahili, Arabic, Hausa, Wolof. Old borders on paper were blurring under the heat of a new kind of unity, one forged not in treaties, but in dignity. Traoré stood again, this time not at a podium, but in the center of the room. "We are not your commodities," he said. "We are not raw exports waiting to be refined by foreign hands." He locked eyes with Bessent. "You came for gold, but you found fire." The room was silent again, this time not from shock, but from something deeper, acknowledgement. A reckoning, a shift in the center of gravity. Traoré didn't wait for applause. He didn't need it. He walked out the same way he walked in, with the calm of a man who had nothing left to beg for, and everything left to fight for. And as he stepped into the sunlight, the wind whispered through the capital's flags, not the stars and stripes, but the rising banners of a continent ready to rewrite the rules. By nightfall, the ripple effects of Traoré's speech had reached beyond the marble corridors of international power. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered beneath flickering streetlights, watching subtitled clips of his words projected onto concrete walls. In Dakar, university students chanted his name between debates. And in Nairobi, elders spoke his words in hushed tones to the young, like a story passed through generations. Meanwhile, in New York, Scott Bessent sat alone in his suite high above Manhattan, staring at a glowing map of Africa. Red dots marked mining contracts, green ones, active American operations. Gold circles, untapped zones projected to hold billions in rare earths. But now, every dot seemed unstable, every marker glowed like a warning. He turned to an aide. How much gold is actually locked under Burkinabe soil? Estimates say over 154 metric tons, but that's just the registered zones. With modern tech, it could be triple. And who else knows this? Everyone does now, the aide admitted grimly. Traoré just broadcast it to the world. Bessent's fist slammed against the desk. He's making Africa look like the prize. That's dangerous. You can't let the prize know it's the prize. Down the hallway, a private line buzzed. It was an oil magnate from Texas. Scott, the voice crackled, if that guy keeps stirring the pot, we'll lose West Africa to the Chinese, or worse, to themselves. But Bessent had already turned his gaze toward a solution. We don't need to fight Traoré, he said slowly. We need to fracture him, divide the alliances. Find his weak points. Every man has them. Yet in Ouagadougou, Traoré was moving with a different logic, one built not on the old game of leverage, but a new one, loyalty. That night, he convened his inner circle. We are entering a new war, he told them. It won't be fought with tanks or missiles. It will be waged in contracts, broadcasts, investments, and sabotage. He held up a folder marked, Operation Sovereign Veins. This is not just about Burkina Faso, he said. It's about every inch of land stolen by deception. It's about telling the world, Africa is not your vault. And with that, the meeting began, not with handshakes, but with vows. 2 days later, a convoy of armored SUVs carved its way through the rugged countryside of northern Ghana, dust clouds trailing behind. Inside the lead vehicle, a U.S. diplomat adjusted his tie nervously while clutching a leather folder marked, Confidential, Resource Negotiations. Across from him sat a silent man in dark glasses, Scott Bessent's envoy. His presence alone carried weight. This wasn't diplomacy. This was pressure, cloaked in formality. Their destination, a discreet summit organized by Western financial backers, mining CEOs, and African intermediaries. The goal, isolate Traoré diplomatically and economically. The method, seduction and fear. Inside the compound, banners draped the walls, securing Africa's future, together. But behind the stage, the real strategy unfolded. Buy out his allies, one executive said. Fund opposition media, said another. Dig for dirt, someone whispered. Scott Bessent's voice echoed through the room via satellite feed. We don't need to defeat Traoré. We just need to make him look like a risk. But hundreds of miles away, in a quiet clearing under the Burkinabe moonlight, Traoré met with leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Around a fire, the glow flickered across their faces as he unfolded a map. We've all been offered deals, he said. Money. Contracts. Security. Heads nodded. But every coin comes with a chain. He tapped a region marked in red, an untouched vein of gold running between the Sahel nations. If we control this, not just the land, but the processing, the shipping, the currency exchange, we become unbreakable. The others stared, then leaned forward. This is the moment they fear, Traoré said. Not war. Not weapons. But Africans refusing the leash. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then, Mali's minister raised a glass. To Traoré. No, Traoré said, shaking his head. To what comes after me. Because he knew, it wasn't about a man anymore. It was about momentum. And the more they tried to silence him, the louder the continent began to speak. Back in Washington, the White House Situation Room buzzed with unease. A wall-sized screen displayed satellite images of a newly fortified trade route stretching across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Military bases, rail lines, and digital infrastructure, all financed not by the IMF or World Bank, but by an alliance of African-led banks and Middle Eastern investors. Scott Bessent stared at the images, jaw tight. "They're building an economic firewall," he muttered. One CIA officer leaned forward. "And Traoré just signed a barter deal, gold for Iranian drones. Low visibility tech. Hard to track." A silence fell over the room. This wasn't just sovereignty. This was audacity. "He's rewriting the rules," another analyst whispered. Bessent slammed his hand down. "Then we change the board." That afternoon, a flurry of fake news articles erupted across West African media, stories claiming Traoré had offshore accounts, secret meetings with Wagner, even plots against fellow African leaders. Each headline bore the fingerprints of AI-generated disinformation. But the people weren't buying it. In Ouagadougou's main square, a street vendor held up a printed article claiming Traoré had fled the country. He laughed, turned to a crowd, and shouted, "Fled? I just saw him on a motorbike, passing soldiers with his fist in the air." Laughter spread. So did defiance. Traoré, meanwhile, wasn't hiding. He was preparing. In a dim war room lined with screens and strategy maps, he addressed a coalition of ministers and tech experts. "They think the war is on the battlefield," he said. "But it's here, in code, in currency, in control." He pointed to a new digital currency prototype, Afrolion. "Built on our terms. Backed by our resources. Immune to their sanctions." Someone asked, "What if they retaliate?" Traoré smiled. "They already are. That's how we know we're winning." At that moment, across the ocean, Bessent stood in front of a closed door labeled, Emergency Africa Response Protocol. He placed his hand on the knob. "Open it," he said grimly. But no one noticed the tremor in his fingers. Because deep down, even Scott Bessent was beginning to realize. This wasn't just about gold anymore. Inside that room labeled Emergency Africa Response Protocol, something ancient stirred beneath modern machinery, an intelligence operation designed for regime manipulation, economic sabotage, and psychological warfare. Bessent didn't hesitate. He activated Project Dune, a covert initiative engineered during the Cold War to destabilize mineral-rich regions under hostile control. But Traoré had already anticipated this move. Back in Burkina Faso, a young cryptographer named Aminata entered the president's briefing room. She placed a tablet on the table. "They've launched digital interference," she said. "Fake bank alerts, cloned news sites, identity spoofing across our social channels." Traoré looked up. "And?" She smirked. "We built our system on sandstorms, sir. They can't see us coming." The room laughed, not out of naivety, but because they had prepared for this moment for months. Every ministry, every communications line, every economic relay had been mirrored offline. The fake alerts hit shadows. The real systems continued, untouched. Meanwhile, the people were not idle. University students flooded forums with counternarratives. Artists painted murals of Traoré standing atop a mountain of broken chains. Women in markets whispered, "They fear him because he's free." And across Africa, something even more dangerous began to spread, hope. In Senegal, a mayor renamed a district, Traoré Square. In South Africa, protesters held signs that read, "Our minerals, our future." Even in the streets of Baltimore and Chicago, black activists began quoting Traoré in rallies, drawing uncomfortable attention from U.S. media. Back in D.C., Bessent stared at a classified intelligence memo. Traoré has become more than a leader. He is a symbol. A virus of resistance spreading across continents. He tore the paper in half. "This ends now," he said. But even as his voice echoed through the marble halls, something inside him wavered. Because no matter how much power he commanded, no matter how many tools he deployed, he couldn't stop a man who had already won the hearts of the Scott. Bessent had always believed in dominance through discretion. But now, every discreet channel was burning. The World Bank issued a nervous statement. The IMF requested an emergency review of African debt protocols. France, caught between historical guilt and financial dependency, froze its quiet lobbying efforts. And in the private clubs of Geneva, oil executives whispered of the African turn. Meanwhile, Traoré's message was spreading, not through propaganda, but through resonance. In Nairobi, young engineers wore shirts printed with "Over my dead body." In Lagos, a rapper dropped a track sampling Traoré's UN speech, and it hit 10 million streams in 3 days. Even in Paris, disillusioned students spray-painted "Africa isn't yours to fix. It's yours to free." And in the US, things grew complicated. Cable hosts struggled to frame Traoré. Was he a nationalist? A Marxist? A spiritual revolutionary? No label fit, and that made him dangerous. So they turned to fear. "He's rejecting global norms," said one. "He could inspire domestic chaos," said another. "Africa's going rogue," warned a third. But underneath the noise, something else stirred. African American scholars began holding panels, reimagining global power, what Traoré teaches us. Former soldiers wrote op-eds, "Why I would have fought for him." Polls showed a sharp shift in youth sentiment. 67% now viewed African sovereignty as essential to global balance. Bessent read every report. Each chart, each headline, each redacted dossier told the same story: control was slipping. He gathered with his inner circle in a cold-lit bunker outside Langley. "What's our final play?" someone asked. Bessent looked up, his eyes like steel under strain. "We don't crush him," he said. "We turn the world against him. Discredit. Isolate. Divide." But as they began planning smear campaigns, black budget leaks, and whispered coups, a low voice came from the room's corner, a young analyst, barely 30. "You can't erase him," she said quietly. "He's not just a leader. He's become a myth." Everyone turned. Silence reigned. Because she wasn't wrong. And myths? They're harder to kill than men. The UN was buzzing again. Not with excitement, but tension. News had leaked that Scott Bessent would appear before the General Assembly. Not as a speaker, but as a shadow pulling strings, organizing private meetings, pushing emergency resolutions, rallying allies to sanction Burkina Faso. Traoré knew. He stepped into the building with no bodyguards, no notes, no translator. Just his conviction, and the weight of a continent behind him. Inside, the temperature dropped. Diplomats turned their heads. Some with admiration. Others with fear. And in the back row, Bessent watched. He had hoped Traoré would lash out, make a mistake, show weakness. But what he saw was a man unshaken by threats, unburdened by approval. A man who had found his purpose in the crucible of history. Traoré took the podium. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just spoke, with clarity that cut deeper than any condemnation. "For centuries, you called us your colonies. You said we had no future unless you shaped it. But our land birthed your wealth. Our hands built your cities. Our silence fed your empires. That silence is gone. You want our gold? You want our oil? You'll pay in respect, or not at all." A murmur swept the room. Cameras zoomed in. The words were trending before they even finished echoing. Bessent shifted in his chair. Then came the final blow. "You called me dangerous. Not because I raised a fist. but because I raised a mirror. He stepped down. The room stayed quiet. No applause. No protest. Just stunned stillness. Outside, thousands gathered, watching on screens, chanting his name. From Johannesburg to Jakarta, from Detroit to Dakar, the world was no longer divided by borders. It was dividing by truth. And in that moment, Scott Bessent realized something chilling. He had lost. Not the battle. Not the narrative. But the future. Because the future now spoke with Traoré's voice. And no sanction, smear, or strategy could silence that.